Okay, so welcome everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. We are a global group here. I am Sean Patrick Hughes, and for those of you who have joined us, I'm with Phil Klay, who needs no introduction. But I'll take about 60 seconds to do a quick intro into kind of how this came about, because I think it's relevant to that. And then Phil is going to lead us through a discussion on the reading that we put in the sign-up form, and really just writing and the use of humor to tell kind of the hardest and darkest tales. So Phil wrote a beautiful book about the war that we both served in called Redeployment. And I've actually read it a couple times and written about it a couple times. And the reason it's a beautiful book is because of its honesty in a world of memoirs and self-help books about war. Be a novel, because the novel is the honest book. It's told without narrative, it's told without self-promotion, and it's told without a sense of history about how the author will be viewed. And that's why I love that book so much, because layered through it is, I think, two themes. One is that the world wants to see in a war what it sees, and so the people that serve in it tell the story of a war the way they think that the room wants to hear it. And I've certainly been in the middle of that. But the other part is that throughout the book and throughout my experience, the humor is what you probably remember the most. It is there, it's ever present, it is often inappropriate, it is crass, it is funny above all things, because the human experience is best served with a healthy dose of laughter. And so what's true of life and war is true of great fiction and writing, or nonfiction writing too. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about. And so without any further of me talking, I'll give you enough lead-in time to get your notes together. Phil is going to talk through the four areas of reading. My two disclaimers are: one, I am miserable at understanding Emerson. So I'm excited to learn. That is not new for me. I've struggled with him for years. And two, that I really, really enjoyed a couple of short stories that I'd never read before. So I thought it was great. So thanks, Phil, for turning us on to that. So
which one did you like the most? I'm curious.
So the good Southern
good country people.
Yeah, like how do you get away from a story where he steals a woman's leg and runs?
It's one of the high points of fiction.
Like
high points of art.
See it coming.
There's Chartres Cathedral, and there's the moment where the Bible salesman steals Olga's leg. It's so great.
Yeah, I didn't see it, and then like just the ticker that I too have believed in nothing my whole life, and it's brought me here. And one of us has your leg, and it's not you.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So
yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much. And you know, this is a great group. This is kind of the size of group that I hoped we would have, because you can actually have a discussion. So that, you know, if you guys want to jump in, feel free to. And thanks for showing up. Yeah. It's something I've thought about.
Sorry, Phil, I'll monitor the chat. So just one hygiene thing I didn't throw out there. I will monitor chat. Phil's gonna lead the conversation. So yeah. I think questions are good to start in chat, but it's also a small enough group to just throw a hand up, and we'll go there. Sorry,
yeah.
Phil.
So, you know, I remember early on when I was in military training, there was this field exercise that we did. And my stories of being miserable in military training are relatively limited, because I was a public affairs officer. I picked like the easiest thing you could possibly be. So it was at the basic school. We went out on a field exercise where the first day the temperature was like in the low 30s, and then it torrentially rained, and then the temperature dropped 15 degrees and everything froze. Like there was ice inside my boots. And then towards the end of the week, the temperature rose again, and it rained again, and there was a live fire exercise. And so we've been just utterly frigid for a week. and we're like, and it's a live fire at night, and it's horribly raining, and we're just like, you have to run and then get down into the mud and shoot, and it's just really unpleasant. And as we're just sitting there shivering, waiting to go, we're just going, this sucks so fucking much, and then cracking up as if that was the funniest joke anyone had ever told. And this one captain is like a combat vet, just like comes up and he's like, yep, that's how you do it. It's gonna get a lot worse and a lot funnier. And that is, one of those really important training things that you get. And it has always struck me that some of the funniest books that have ever been written are about war. Good Soldiers Fight, Celine, Catch-22, just so many really funny books. And the humor goes right to the heart of it. And there's a part I always think about from Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, where the officer is giving the men this mission that they're about to go on. And he, kind of goes through the whole thing and he says, between the six of us, but you youngsters must be careful not to let the men know this is what they call a subsidiary attack. There'll be no troops in support. We've just got to go over and keep the enemy busy while the folk on our right do the real work. You notice that the bombardment is much heavier over there. They've knocked out the Hohenzollern Redoubt to bits. Personally, I don't give a damn either way. We'll get killed, whatever happens. And then there's a paragraph break, and it says, we all laughed, right? And they're all laughing because it's true. And war literature is full of those bits of really hard humor. I see Stefan Mealy says, I served in the Swiss Army. They asked me at some point to help write letters to the US Army because my English was not so bad. Yeah, and movies too. Yeah, Private Benjamin. And so as I've been writing about war for the past, God, it's been a while now, decade and a half, almost 2 decades at this point. Humor has been an important part of it because it is an essential part of the experience. And I don't think that the humor is just destructive, right? There's or a kind of like spoonful of medicine, a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go. I mean, that's oftentimes like how, it's like things are really bad, so you make a joke so you can get through it. Or Milan Kundera, people who aren't humorous tend to see sacrilege in every joke. It's because every joke is sacrilege, right? He thinks of humor, and I have the sort of fundamental sense that there's something importantly wrong with that. And so I've been thinking about this particular subject for a while. I do want to ask if that what I just said, Sean, jives with your military experience.
So 100%. I think what would be interesting is imagine a world where you pulled all that humor out of it,
right,
and then try to do the things that we did. And this is not, and no political statement here at all, but where I exist in my day-to-day life now and in larger kind of corporate areas, all of that humor is gone.
Yeah.
It's just not there. And I don't think that environment is on, and there's reasons for that. And we understand the reasons for that. It's not the same environment. We're not tasked with the same things. And so we shouldn't have the same standards. But I do wonder a little bit about where, the bonds are not quite as tight. And so that very real bonding, I think one of the things that's interesting, certainly in kind of male intensive units, and I was a special operations, so we by rule had 100% men. I once did 180 days where we didn't, like, there was not a woman in the 60-person camp that we're at. They didn't come inside the wire. We didn't see a single woman that was an American woman. And in that group, what's interesting isn't like, it doesn't turn to misogynist or terrible. What ends up happening is the torture we impose upon each other becomes some therapy. And that's some strange thing where if anybody outside this group said this, it'd be fighting words. But it's a bonding thing, and trying to explain that to the outside world, that these horrible things we all say about each other inside this wire with us as a group binds us together. And like, it's this weird cohesion that I've just never seen it anywhere else in any other circumstance.
What was the you talked about being those male units where there's no women. What was the name of that? It's like this very beautiful blonde Australian newscaster who kind of went in like a Fox News direction and like conspiracy theories after she'd like done something for 60 Minutes. Lara Logan. Okay. Lara Logan shows up to I was a public affairs officer, so she shows up to a unit that has not has not seen women. Like you've said, it's just been dudes out in the desert for a long time. And she decides that she's going to do like her talk while she walks down into an irrigation ditch in like a t-shirt, and then out of the irrigation ditch while she's talking about the war, with the water just sort of coming off of her. And every Marine on the outpost is just like, I need to go to the Porta-John. Yeah. Anyway, I love Isabella points out that the time during childbirth can be a very freaking funny place to be. Yeah, absolutely. And also there's that like terrifying element of it too, you know?
Well, that's why it's funny.
Tons of analogies that go through early child rearing. And like, I remember very similar to your story, Phil, about this sucks and it's funny. The amount of times looking at my wife through, we had 4, 3, and 1-year-old together.
Right.
And it was just a disaster. Like, it was a disaster. It was a war zone. And we'd look at each other, and like, I'd walk in and there'd be like dirty diaper on the floor, food on the wall. And I just look at it and I go, perfect.
Yeah.
Start laughing.
Yeah. So
same thing.
As I mentioned, I've been going through things, and this Emerson essay I really love. I mean, it's funny too, because I was talking about it with, or I had a Twitter exchange with Adam Weinstein, as a journalist, about it, because I posted something from this, and he said, "This is so Emerson, beautiful, true, and a clear admission that he couldn't be funny if his life depended on it." And this is an essay where he tells like a bunch of jokes, and not a single one of them does he do well, right? The Tamerlane joke is actually funny, but his version of it is so baggy and wordy, and everywhere else.
So it's not just me like that. I thought the exact. Okay,
no,
great.
He's utterly unfunny, just totally terrible. Can't make a joke to save his life. Beautiful sentences, and yet I think there's something really, really profound. And there's a couple things in the essay that are important to me. One of them is this sense, he talks about like the philosopher, right? Who has this sort of pure sense of reason in the way that things should be. Reason does not joke, and men of reason do not a prophet in whom the moral sentiment predominates, or a philosopher in whom the truth of love of truth predominates. These do not joke, but they bring the standard, the ideal whole, exposing all actual defect, and hence the best of all jokes is a sympathetic contemplation of things by the understanding from the philosopher's point of view. There is no joke so true and deep in actual life as when some pure idealist goes up and down among the institutions of society, attended by a man who knows the world, and who, sympathizing with the philosopher's scrutiny, sympathizes also with the confusion and indignation of the detected, skulking institutions. His perception of disparity, his eye wandering perpetually from the rule to the crooked, lying, thieving fact, makes the eyes run over with laughter. This is the radical joke of life and then of literature. And what I love there is I think that the Joker is actually the more sympathetic type next to the philosopher, right? There's a wonderful paper by a philosopher called Moral Saints, where the opening line is something like, I don't know if there is such a thing as a moral saint, but if there are, I'm very glad that no one that I know is one of them, right? And just this image of this like perfect person always doing the moral where, yeah, Susan Wolf, yeah, wonderful writer. Thank you, Thomas. And it's that sympathy with the confusion and indignation of the detected skulking institutions, the crooked, lying, thieving fact with human beings, right, in our full nature, that is really important, that sees, and it's not that it forgives everything, right, or doesn't admit of the ideal, but it actually has a degree of assent to the world as it is, and I think that's really, really important, and it allows them to see the world in a more straightforward and moral way. The other thing that I love, and this is, I think, it's something that you find in a lot of Americans talking about humor, is this sort of democratic sense. Wit makes its own welcome, levels all distinctions. No dignity, no learning, no force of character can make any stand against good wit. It is like ice, on which no beauty of form, no majesty of carriage can plead any immunity. They must walk gingerly, according to the laws of ice, or down they must go, dignity and all. It's a great image. Yeah.
So Phil, I think what was interesting, like what I told you, my disclaimer was Emerson. I struggle with Emerson. I don't do well to understand him. It's like a block. But
Yeah.
like what's interesting is as you read through that in the institution side, back to like your writing, your civil affairs major, to me, one who it's 50-50 whether or not I worked with the exact same person you had in mind. But
okay, somebody wanted me to teach Iraqis baseball, right? The thing about that is I didn't actually invent anything in that story. I'm not a very creative person. Yeah.
Of course, like,
yeah.
And when I read that, the beauty of that lays right into this is that the ridiculousness of the institution gets exposed.
Yeah.
To the very serious person that is trying in earnest to do right. And what's funny about it is that gasp, that gap, like that gap between that, like they're getting the emails from the people back stateside who believe they understand what it takes to get this done. And you have this giant like soup sandwich of a mess over here that you're trying to, and you're going to teach them baseball, and that's going to solve it. And that gap between that is like, I think maybe you've dissected it a little bit for me.
So I don't know if folks have read that story. It's one of the stories in my first book.
Sorry,
but it's about a civil affairs, a foreign service officer who's very smart and comes to Iraq and like sees everything wrong with the fucked up way that we're doing reconstruction and tries to like make the system work. And there's a fat comical major who he initially thinks is a total idiot, who doesn't fight the system at all, kind of accepts it in a sort of Shrek kind of way, if anybody's a Good Soldier Shrek fan. And he makes the system work for him, right? By just kind of like putting his big tubby arms around the insanity and giving it a good sweaty squeeze. Isabel, Freud really honored humor in its role in seeing and communicating things straight. Yeah, exactly. And that's why there's, the other line in the Emerson is the perception of the comic is a tie of sympathy with other men, a pledge of sanity, and a protection from those perverse tendencies and gloomy insanities in which fine intellects sometimes lose themselves. A rogue alive to the ludicrous is still convertible. If that sense is lost, his fellow men can do little for him. I think that's really important. And, I mean, oftentimes we think about humor, and there's no statement you can make about humor that sort of applies for all types of humor. It just can't. And there's always like punching down, punching up, whatever sort of thing. A lot of philosophers are kind of horrified by humor. And I think they're horrified by it often because a lot of humor has an element of cruelty in it, right? Don Quixote is the great comic book, and like the half of that novel is just people getting tortured, basically. And also one of the great diarrhea scenes in all of literature. Like the point that you made, Sean, is important, that like you're saying things to folks that might be fighting words, but in a particular context, in a context where the comic is really present, it's actually something that binds you together very, very tightly. And I think this is one of the really key reasons that humor is so important. Humor is ultimately about community and solidarity, right? It's about connections to other people. It's about making somebody else laugh, not just yourself. And the response to horror that people expect is like people heroically suffering, whereas people in the midst of horror continue being people, right? There's a wonderful essay by Tom Slay, a poet I really, really admire, where he talks about covering a famine in Somalia. And he sees this child who has what he calls his eyes had the famine gawk of the dying, that curious sidelong stare of a bird that perched on your windowsill suddenly catches your eye, its stare meeting your stare or seeming to. His head lolled in his mother's lap. He seemed listless on the verge of coma with the apathetic drowse that precedes it. But then this kid gets fed plumpy nut, which is like a nutritional thing that they give people who have suffered famine. And the calories sort of hit, right? He ate the biscuit slowly, and by the time he'd finished, he was taking in his surroundings, particularly the shiny silver foil that the biscuit had come in. And he took the foil from his mother and began throwing it up in the air, playing with it, recovering it in a few moments because of the sugars, the instinct to play. What was my rage then? This boy had shown me something about the starving and the dying that I hadn't known until that moment, that up until they lapse from consciousness, they're still part of their world, deeply rooted in their own attachments. They don't shed who they are, and easy pity won't help you see their individual fates and quirks of character. Nobody, until the very end at least, turns into the sharply defined ribs and swollen bellies of the news photos. And that play instinct is obviously present in humor, right? It's something that people in a situation that is fundamentally dehumanizing do, which is on a basic level, a rebellion against that. And what's sort of funny is that oftentimes we, the comfortable, expect of people in horrific situations to conform to those to images that will allow us easy pity, right? You can see this in the way that we respond to famine. I have a friend who is unjustly accused of murder and spent time in prison. And one of the reasons that this happened to, one of the things that people focused on was after this person that had been murdered, she didn't behave the right way, right? Of course, people who've been through incredibly shocking things, they never behave the right way, right? And that's, that's so common. That's so common in false convictions. Right?
What is the right way is an interesting question.
Right.
From my interrogator days, which is not my happiest days, but like, one of the things they tell us, there is no right way. So when the truth actually matters, you throw that out.
Right. People don't conform to a type when put under pressure. That, how do you know, Anna?
It was 50-50 on me based on retweets.
Yeah.
No,
I
she's
think about it because I once survived the fire, and afterwards I behaved really weirdly. And it was maybe like 2 years after she was released initially. And I read about her doing yoga or something in the holding cell, which I understand that it can be like an expression of nervous energy. And we know that female criminals sometimes do these like extreme physical acts to kind of, but it's a different thing from doing yoga, which is to like stretch when you have been sitting for 5 hours. But after I survived the fire, and I remember having behaved really strangely, even to myself, I completely got it. I was like, you are just on a different plane of existence, and that's fine. You just like forgive yourself, you know. But if you happen to be under suspicion for murder, that's really unfortunate in the most tragic way possible. I don't know if she has the sense of humor about it, though. I probably wouldn't.
But never, and you're not supposed to ever laugh again or find things funny again. So what's interesting about that is we're in every other circumstance, we're all widely agreed that the best thing to do is laugh a little, find some levity. But in these other circumstances, when we see people from the outside, especially people who are in need, or people who are a suspect of some ill doing, they're supposed to be contrite in all things. And it's just not the way that it works. And like Phil, to your point, like it's things are funny no matter what in all circumstances. And sometimes they're even funnier.
Yeah. And that sort of leads me into the Hassan Blessing, the reality in the record, right? Because there's that great opening bit where he talks about how there's two stories, right, that refugee seekers have. There's the real one and the one for the record. The stories for the record are the ones the new refugees tell to obtain the right to humanitarian asylum. The real stories remain locked in the hearts of the refugees, for them to mull over in complete secrecy. That's not to say it's easy to tell the two stories apart. They merge and it becomes impossible to distinguish between them, right? Which is also one of those, you know, you were talking about coming back and like performing your role in the Iraq War for an audience whose expectations of that war you're aware of, and then like the reality becoming somewhat blurred in your mind. And you know, Blasian was a refugee himself. He knows the process, and yet this story is so funny. I mean, I don't know if you found it funny, but I thought it was hilarious.
No, so Phil, it's there, and I don't know how to express this without. I'll be fearless and go ahead and do it anyway. If you've been around what was happening in that place in that time, and the people who were perpetrating the sorts of things that happened in that story, it's hysterical, because it's like it's tremendously typical, but it's this extreme exaggeration of what was going on. And so if you hadn't read it, they were getting somebody to perform in many different ways as a propaganda machine in service to whatever version of the story need be told. And running in the background is these bag of human heads at all times, which is this other.
The main character is an ambulance driver who, during his last, you know, has got a bag of human heads, and you know, his boss has told him, you know, you need to show respect. So if people are alive and bleeding to death, you need to go like a bat out of hell. But if you're just carrying human heads, you know, you go like a funeral hearse. It doesn't matter. And
and what's like, I don't know if this was intentional. It may be. Almost in every sense of the writing, and also in Emerson's too, like all the short stories involve some dissection of the human body being separated from the whole, and that being central to the humor of it.
Right. Yeah. And also relating this to the Emerson, there is a man of reason in here. The professor, his boss, who's constantly trying to find like meaning and purpose in all of this. Spilled blood and superstition are the basis of the world. Man is not the only creature who kills for bread or love or power, because animals in the jungle do that, but he's the only creature who kills because of faith. The question of humanity can be solved only by constant dread. And the narrator's like, I respected him because he was a philosopher who refused to make foolish jokes, right? And then he gets kidnapped and they do like one of those, you know, hostage videos, and he performs really well, and they're really excited, you know. It's just one of these great moments where it's like this connection.
The data on this one's great, guys. They
Yeah.
love it.
You know, I knew an MP who was at Guantanamo Bay. And so Guantanamo, there's like the hardcore guys like KSM and, you know, whatever. And some of those guys are like straight up sociopaths. And then when he was there was more like the general population. So like a lot of guys who like really were in Al-Qaeda, right? As well as other messed up cases, but which we talked about, the guys who were like really in Al-Qaeda, but were like not so different from the 18-year-old who joins the army, you know? And his Joes got along great with some of these guys. One of his guys was getting relationship advice from, you know, a former Al-Qaeda detainee. At one point, they're doing a prisoner transfer, and the door opens up, and everybody comes out just laughing. And one of his Joes goes, "That guy is hilarious," which, you know, makes sense. Just to go back to that sort of human element that cuts across ideologies and categories that the man of reason likes to think about.
We saw it too when we would be in that line of work. If you were ever in receipt of like if you were monitoring communications,
yeah,
people like develop personas and relationships with people,
right?
And there is no more dry and cutthroat humor than that group of you know, at the time, jihadis, self-labeled jihadis, when they were cutting on each other, and like, this sounds like us.
Yeah,
sounds
remarkably
like us.
Elliot Ackerman is another Marine writer, wonderful writer, great guy. I remember we had a conversation a couple of years ago where he was talking about how the military had put together a task force to try and understand how it was that ISIS was successfully recruiting people from you know, Europe and other places. And Elliot was like, "Really, guys? You need to put together a task force to figure out how somebody's convincing young men to go to a foreign land and get into combat? It's like, you're the best at that in the world." You know, like, talk to your marketing people. But
did you ever see the ad that they put out for the South Pole?
No.
It's basically like, need men, high danger, likelihood of return limited, struggle, difficulty, and 26 people answered it the first day.
Yeah.
That's 120 years ago, whatever.
And, you know, I love that this is one of those stories, and you know, it's like one of the basic ways of like making a joke, because you take some sort of thing and you kind of push it to its logical extreme, right? And the thing that was very obvious in Iraq was there was an ideological veneer to a lot of this stuff, but the ideological veneer was just sitting on top of, you know, a lot of darker human passions, right? And so the move that he does in the story is the guy is kidnapped by this group and he performs really well on the video. And so they trade him to another group for him to record another video where he pretends to be somebody else. And then he just keeps getting, you know, traded to different people. And he's claiming to be a Sunni, a terrorist, a Shia terrorist, a foreign fighter, and then at one point a Spanish soldier, which gets him in trouble because after like the Spanish troops had left before he made the video. And so they beat him. There's a lightness too that's really important, right? You know, Bergson says that the comic depends for its effect on something like a momentary anesthesia of the heart, which must impose silence on our pity. And so like the style really, really matters, and the fact that it's so rapid fire and that the descriptions of the beatings is kind of is rushed through and done for comic effect. Matters a lot in terms of the story working. But
it's funny, I didn't think through that. Like he mentions it's one sentence that the beating happens, and then great detail about the production and feedback loop of it.
Yeah, the production value, the moment when he does a good job and one guy kisses him, right? And says he's a great actor, right?
Marvelous.
Yeah. And of course, like the apotheosis of it, it just kind of escalates until you can escalate no more, where, he declares himself, was it like the head of the head of the new caliphate or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. I'd cut off the heads of hundreds of Sunni men I'd support from Iran. And then like a cow gives a moo is one of the things. Yes. Here we go.
They had to get the cows out of here. There's like,
yeah,
guys, get the cows out of here.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, so just it kind of brings it to its logical conclusion where they execute people in front of him. He declares, they dressed me in the costume of an Afghan fighter, trimmed my beard, put a black turban on my head. 5 men stood behind me. They brought in 6 men screaming and crying out for help from God, his prophet, and the prophet's family. They slaughtered the men in front of me like sheep as I announced that I was the new leader of the Al-Qaeda organization in Mesopotamia and made threats against everyone in creation. And then he gets really, right? And then there's that note that I find really kind of moving at the end, where the ambulance driver summed up his real story in 4 words: I want to sleep. And it's that sort of like balance between that anesthesia of the heart and when there are those moments that open it up that are so important. Should we talk about Saunders? Because he's, I think, a master at this.
So Saunders, my lead-in is I was so excited when you threw any George Saunders in there.
Yeah.
Because he's a delightful human being, and I hope nobody on this believes otherwise. We can handle it in other channels, but I heard him. I had no idea who George Saunders was, and I heard his now famous commencement speech in 2013 for Syracuse, and it was very recent to my return from Iraq, and I was a little bit of a mess. And so I just emailed George. I was like, hey, that was really great. I'm trying to write to feel better about things. Just want to let you know that was a great commencement speech. I got his email address off of like the Syracuse University homepage, and he emails me back. Yeah. And we had a couple year dialogue over email through writing, and like super generous, super sweet and lighthearted guy. And that's relevant to the story because I'm not name dropping, because he can write the most disturbingly funny things that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
While being like this being of love and light at the same time, which is hope for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody that I've never met him in person, but everybody I know who knows him is like, thinks he's wonderful. And he's a hell of a writer. Also, he's just fun. I mean, there's so many different types of humor that are going. I mean, part of it is just, his word choices, joysticks, Drug Town, the TV show How My Child Died Violently. It's just absolutely incredible.
So he does this thing where he names everything badly, but he's so consistent with it that like it's almost like dads trying to name modern culture. Yeah. And the way he does it is he names it badly, and you're like, that's kind of stupid, but it's stupid in every single exact way perfectly.
Right. And it's also like ends. It's close to reality,
right?
So it's like, it's sort of like you're in the uncanny valley, where you're like, well, this is obviously wrong. But part of what's wrong about it is how close it is to actual reality TV, or how it is. And the tone is great. It's like this, it's for those who haven't read it, this is a story of the Blasim, who I did an event with Blasim when he came to New York, and he clearly felt weird about the fact that he was doing an event with a Marine. So he made sure, like, at one point in the conversation, to as like charmingly and genially as possible compare me to a Nazi. And then like we talked about that, and then we finished the event, and then like, we had beers. Anyway, it's like publicist afterwards was like, thanks for handling that well. That's like, no problem. Like you're an Iraqi author, totally get that shot, you know? Fair enough. But I mean, Saunders is writing about something really grim, right? Which is just people being economically crushed. And you could easily imagine the sort of Soviet, you know, socialist realism version of this account, which was just utterly focused on people's, you know, degradation um, and instead there's this like really perfect, flat observational tone that is always kind of emphasizing like the quotidian, meager reality of the world that he's living in, juxtaposed against the kind of threadbare fantasy that they put on top of it, right? So like he works as a male stripper at a place called Joysticks, where, you know, there's like gradations of self-exploitation that you can engage in. And, you know, one of the guys is getting a little bit fatter. One of the guys is really good.
Which is handled, by the way, like handled like you have a normal performance discussion in corporate America.
Exactly.
Which is the funniest thing you've ever heard.
Oh, it's so good. And there's then the one who's like hot. Thomas Kierster's our beautiful boy. He's got long muscles and bright blue eyes. The minute his shirt comes off, two fat ladies hustle up the aisle and stick some money in his pants and ask, will he be their pilot? He says, sure. He brings their salads. He brings their soups. Right? and it's like, will you be our pilot versus, you know, he brings their salads. He brings their soups. It's just such a nice, there's a bit from Ralph Ellison where he says, talking about American humor specifically, for the ex-colonials, the declaration of an American identity meant the assumption of a mask, and it imposed not only the discipline of national self-consciousness, but gave Americans an ironic awareness of the joke that always lies between appearance and reality. And this is like a story where Saunders is always playing with that line, right? In that disparity. And he's doing it in regards to like capitalist marketing, ideology, etc. And the kind of tone, it's very funny because Poe has a thing about how the art of telling a humorous story was created in America and has remained here. The humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects there's anything funny about it. And that kind of style and approach feels like something he's really doing here, because the deadpan Twain's observation, it might have been a little bit overbroad. I'm pretty sure there's no humor outside of America, Anna. Sorry. None in Portugal. I read the whole of the Book of Disquiet. I didn't laugh once.
I read it. I didn't laugh. I'm still trying to figure out what it meant. I'm working on it. Yeah. There's this way, you know, you're talking about the speech that the manager gives as he's firing the fat guy, right? And there's this sort of constant way that you've got the kind of language of managers and elites, right? Like bureaucratic language, or just kind of like stale ideological language that is used to mask dehumanization and pain, right? I mean, the TV show How My Child Died Violently is great, right? Like, it's hosted by Matt Merton, a 6'5" blonde who's always giving the parents shoulder rubs and telling them they've been sainted by pain. The audience is shrieking threats at the parents of the killer, while the parents of the victim urge restraint and forgiveness to such an extent that finally the audience starts shrieking threats at them too. Then it's to a commercial. I think like what that pushes on too is the reality of what is actually acceptable is its own version of terrible.
Yeah.
Yet there's boundaries between what we'll say. Like we won't have the conversation with the person in the corporate performance management / firing discussion around physical appearance, though you do in this role because that's what the job is. but somehow it's supposed to be less ridiculous when we have it around other, actually, frankly, far more impacting personal shortcomings.
Yeah.
And
there are times, Mr. Friend says, when one must move gracefully to the next station in life. Like, for example, certain women in Africa or Brazil, I forget which, who either color their faces or don some kind of distinctive headdress upon achieving menopause. Are you with me?
Africa or Brazil, one of the two.
Yeah. And the other thing is like the sort of rules of the system that get pushed to their absurdity, you know, like when the Ed Anders from the Board of Health comes, he's in charge of ensuring that our penises never show. Also that we don't kiss anyone. None of us ever kisses anyone or shows his penis except Sonny Vance, who does both because he's been saving up to buy a Faxit franchise. As for our penile simulators, yes, we can show them. We can let them stick out of the top of our pants. We can even periodically dampen our tight pants with spray bottles so our simulators really contour. But our real penises, no, they have to stay inside our hot, uncomfortable, oversized simulators.
Who writes that? That's the best.
It's just thinking through the rules, right? I mean, that's of any
There's a
kind of
handbook somewhere.
system.
One assumes
Yeah.
there's a handbook.
Yeah.
For the rule they have to follow.
Yeah. The and then there's the like serious turn comes with Aunt Bernie's death. Her life is only taken seriously in death. I scrunch my eyes tight and try to picture her happy, laughing, poking me in the ribs, but all I can see is her terrified on the couch, right? And all of a sudden, like, there's a real weight to something that had felt light, and we hadn't connected with her before. And he starts dancing poorly, and so he gets the conversation about how he might get fired. We really need the money, I say. Is that my problem? The manager says, am I supposed to let you dance without vigor just because you need the money? Which is, the without vigor is hilarious, but it's also like sort of brutally true. Like, this is the logic of the system. Nobody wants a sad joystick pilot. I see nods. And it's like, and it's that like taking you to that place where all of a sudden it gets really, really serious, that makes the explosion of humor. Because the funniest bit for me is when he comes home and Bernie's alive, right? And it's just fucking incredible. And it's sit the fuck down are her first post-death words. And it's this utter reversal. It's this utter swerve that's been set up by that dip just perfectly. You, mister, are going to start showing your cock. And all of a sudden, it's like this world where you've been cramped in, where there's all this bullshit, right? It's this dry, observational tone that is like revealing the bullshit, but not doing anything about it. So it's funny, but you're also like, there's this, you get that sense of like a kind of buildup that is really important, actually. And I think kind of shows the kind of degradation in a way that, you know, if you read, you know, some of the Gorky, right? You know, Gorky, you're kind of like, all right, I get it, but it's hard to take those characters seriously as human beings. And I don't know if any Gorky fans in the audience, but I'm not like a huge Gorky fan, you know. And he's got like the prostitutes who are like in love with the guy who beats them, and you like, you kind of get it, but all right. And then Bernie is pure id, right? She's action and desire, and she's purposeful. And it's not just that it's funny because the things that she's saying are funny, but it's this release, right? That we hadn't noticed, you know, sort of dramatically building up throughout the story. And she's also fucking right, which is what I love about Bernie, right? Some of their problems are self-inflicted, and they don't have a lot of options. And he should probably start showing his cock, or at least it's going to solve some of their financial difficulties, right? And so the joke that is so like incredible is also just fitting in perfectly with everything that the characters need. It's amazing. And it's also just a glorious rant.
And only in death, right? Yeah. She has to die. and then there's the humor of her literally falling apart as she's saying it, because she's dead. She's lost her opportunity to have to speak the truth in life, and now comes back from the dead. And I don't know, it may be taking Emerson too literally. Like, there's something funny about people falling apart, and always will be, in the delivery of their honest and earnest truth.
Right. And also just people totally exposed. I mean, like, it is funny on Twitter. I think Elizabeth Brunig made this point, like, people being horny in public, we find hilarious, right? just being open, and just being totally open with what their actual desires are. I'm getting me so many lovers. I'm going to get my nipples hard standing in the breeze from the ocean, eating shrimp from a cup, you sons of bitches. Tell anyone I'm here, you all die. Plus they die. Whoever you tell, they die. I kill them with my mind. I can do that. I'm very freaking strong now. I got powers.
Then her arm falls off.
And, you know, her like phase 1 plan, they meet a character named Freddie, who's basically like believes in like meritocracy. And, you know, and whose job is just like less degrading, but still kind of degrading. Her phase 1 plan is basically the American dream. It's like, how do you get yourself out of this shit? Like, you make serious compromises, right? You make serious compromises and you do what you have to do. And at a certain point, like, the pure humor right before she dies gets like mixed with sadness almost kind of perfectly. You know, if they don't solve things, one of the kids is going to die. Look, show your cock. It's the shortest line between 2 points. The world ain't giving away nice lives. You got a trust fund? You're a genius? Show your cock. It's what you got. And remember, Troy, in September, on his trike, one leg twisted. Don't forget. Why do some people get everything and I got nothing? She says. Why? Why was that? I don't know, I say. Show your cock, she says, and dies again.
It's great.
Yeah. The humor.
Like, high,
go ahead.
Like, high George energy too. Like, that's his thing.
Every aspect of modern capitalism, right? The continual falseness of it is being skewered, from the American dream to the manageries, to the phone sex girls really enjoying bananas while the screen flashes. Not necessarily the girls who man the phones, not necessarily the girls who man the phones. And the humor, I think, doesn't just critique the system in this place, it deprives it of dignity, right? You cannot speak the language of the system in this story in the way that managers do, or advertisers do, or Freddie does, and not make yourself a joke, right? And the only thing that has weight in the story is pain and love, right? Bernie, beloved aunt who got nothing. Shall we move on to O'Connor? Anything else anybody want to say about this? Saunders amazing.
His he did a reading from Lincoln and Nabardo at the LA library. I drove up to see it, and it's amazing. I don't know if anybody's read that one. His short story book, 10th November, is, I think, my favorite of his, but the Bardo is outrageous in its entire structure. If you've not seen it, it's basically a bunch of ghosts in the cemetery, and Lincoln's one of them, and there's one ghost that has an enormous erection the entire story. It's 200 pages. It appears and disappears, but it's great. And I'm a huge fan, so that I love that story. But Flannery O'Connor's is my favorite of the four. So we're shifting.
I think she's my favorite too, and I think that, I think she's the deepest writer, and also just she's so good. Like, when I was rereading this, I was like, God, like, this is terrifying. Like, there's sometimes writers who, even if I don't think I could write as well as they do, like, I can understand how they work, right? And then there are writers who are just like, I don't even know where this came from. And she's one of those, right? And she's a religious writer, and that's, I think, really important. And you can see too how, like, with a bad religious writer, this you could write this same story and it could be terrible, because at the end of the day, it's basically Flannery O'Connor playing a really mean trick on atheists who sneer at people who have religion like she does, right? And so it's a dangerous story. Jen Frey did in her intellect salon on O'Connor. I bet she was awesome. Yeah, Frey's great. Okay, I'll just stop and just read what Thomas just wrote. In keeping with the theme, I just picked up my 14-year-old daughter and drove her back home. Start to end coincided with the show your cock stretch.
We should have put like an 18+ sign on the salon. Sorry. We didn't think, Phil, like when it's Nabokov, we do it, but with you, I had no idea.
It's literature.
It was just like evil, that doesn't have ratings, apparently.
So, yeah, it could be really bad, actually. And O'Connor there's a couple moves that she makes that I think that are incredible to me. But one of the things that I think about when I think about this kind of writing, there's something that Auden said, where he said, the man who takes seriously the command of Christ to take up his cross and follow him must, if he is serious, see himself as a comic figure. For he is not the Christ, only an ordinary man. Yet he believes that the command, be ye perfect, is seriously addressed to himself, right? Which is related a bit to the Emerson, where he's talking about sort of, see any individual being in separate, and it just seems absurd, right? There's a wonderful bit in the philosopher Thomas Nagel has an essay on the absurd, where he's basically like, because we have self-consciousness, we feel the impact and import of our own desires and goals and sort of mystery of ourselves, and yet we're also able to sort of look at ourselves almost from the outside, the way you would look at an ant trying to struggle up like a little dirt pile, and just the perception of absurdity is inherent in that. And so, but I want to get back to something about that sort of relationship between sort of humor and religion. There's a philosopher, Ted Cohen, who's got an interesting book on jokes. He was at Harvard. He used to, when he'd hear a good joke, he'd call up Stanley Cavell and tell him the joke. And if Stanley Cavell wasn't in, he would leave the joke on his answering machine. I just love that so much. And he links humor and religion, and he offers up the Hebrew Bible as a place where we find the fully human, fully acceptable response to the mystification of the world is a laughing acceptance, a kind of spiritual embrace. We respond with humor and also with prayer, not only to moments of intense joy, but also of pain. Not simply physical pain, but also the deeper pain that comes from the attachment to others who are like us, limited, finite, and vulnerable. And Cohen notes that the story of the Jewish people, beginning with God's promise of a child to Abraham, begins with laughter. Abraham cracks up and literally falls on his face laughing. And his wife is afraid to laugh in front of God, so she laughs inwardly. And God is like, did you laugh? And she's like, no, I didn't. And God goes, you did laugh. And then she names their child, the beginning of this great chain of descendants who's going to give rise to nations, Isaac, which means laughter. And Sarah declares, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And there's that link between sort of prayers and laughter as both deeply human responses to the absurdity, mystery, and cruelty of the world. And O'Connor, I think, is both cruel and religious and committed to that sort of mystery, right? So, as always with O'Connor, she begins with just incredible characters. I mean, that opening paragraph with, she go forward and reverse, right? Is wonderful. And then Mrs. Hopewell had no bad qualities of her own, but she was able to use other people's in such a constructive way that she'd kept them on for 4 years. Nothing is perfect. This was one of Mrs. Hopewell's favorite sayings. Another was, that is life. And still another, the most important was, well, other people have their opinions too. She would make these statements, usually at the table, in a tone of gentle insistence, as if no one held them but her, and the large, hulking Joy, whose constant outrage had obliterated every expression from her face, would stare just a little to the side of her, her eyes icy blue, with the look of someone who had achieved blindness by an act of will and means to keep it. Ah, so good. And one of the things that I think that she does that helps her save this from being a sort of simple takedown of her enemies is that Joy is obviously herself, right? Doomed to die young, stumping around in the habits of being. She talks a lot about stumping around on her crutches in ways that are reminiscent of the way that she describes Joy. And also seeing through people to nothing, right? O'Connor, go for it, Sean.
Yeah, I think what really drives it home is for how long Joy is the sympathetic character in the story. And it's really hard to go from the sympathetic character to the butt of the point of what you're saying is that, I believe nothing for much longer than you have.
Yeah.
And I've got your leg.
Yeah.
Is kind of the point. But like, I think you're right. I hadn't read much Flannery O'Connor. I think probably the last time I read it was in high school when I had to at some point, and it just hits you differently. It's so well done and everybody is so developed, but you start to catch wind a little bit with the boy, probably maybe a page and a half out, his fascination about the connection of the leg.
The funny thing about it was reading it this time, it's obvious from the very beginning that he's a con man, right? Oh, he
salesman.
Said,
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, pretending to look puzzled, but with his eyes sparkling. I saw it said the Cedars, So he's lying from the beginning. And then he's got the move where it was rather as if the suitcase had moved first, jerking him after it, right? He's total salesman. And then his backstory makes it clear he's done his research, right? He's good country people and he's got a heart condition, right? He's telling her exactly what she needs to hear.
And you assume it's because he wants to sell a Bible.
Yeah.
Which for some reason makes it, not for some reason, because it quite literally is a more noble cause than stealing a woman's prosthetic leg.
Depends on your perspective.
But
if you're, I don't know, if you're like early Sam Harris, maybe you would dispute that characterization.
We have one, I have to say this, and I don't have to take us off, but we have one of those book exchanges in the children's, like in the park next to my house. And there's a Sam Harris book of plays in there. And I'm like, what psychopath put this in the children's playground?
Okay.
They're great. I love them.
Somebody in the children's playground, which is always stocked with children's books. Somebody took all of the children's books out and replaced it with a bunch of adult books. And the front-facing one was like Norman Podhoretz, book on his enemies. Right?
Brilliant.
What the hell?
It's performance art right there.
It was too perfect. Yeah. Thomas Arnold. Yeah. Oh, Flannery O'Connor with Flambage, Sam Harris. Yeah. Well, the one I like thinking about is, because you think about like there's this Protestant versus Catholic writers, to make like a gross simplification. Like Catholic writers are always writing like freaks and con men and just really fucked up characters, which I think is actually deeply related to some specific theological commitments. Where it's like Protestant writers often will write really beautiful depictions of good people. Wendell Berry has done some really wonderful, and Marilyn Robinson. And I just think about like, what if Flannery O'Connor had written Gilead, and just the horrible things that she would have done to Reverend Ames, like, would have been so funny. She would have put that poor man through hell. Because there's no way. Anyway, of course, Marilyn Robinson doesn't really like O'Connor. But yeah. So there's those like little bits of philosophy that Holga has related to. Interestingly enough, some Catholic theology, like Malebranche, and some stuff that sounds like Heidegger on metaphysics. And then what I love is there's a kind of meta joke that she builds in. So there's Holga as this kind of monster, but also these like little glimpses of something more. There's the leg being blown off in her background. There's also that moment when the woman starts calling her Holga, and she would say something and add the name Holga to the end of it, and the big spectacled joy Holga would scowl and redden as if her privacy had been intruded upon. She considered the name her personal affair. And so the fact that she changed her name to Holga, which is hilarious, right?
Yeah.
And just did it ugly. It's just funny and cartoonish.
Joy, sorry.
Yeah. Becomes something like a hint at something more private and serious. And those notes are really light. And then as we start getting closer and closer to the Bible salesman stealing her leg, she gets much more complicated and much more humanized and much more sort of tender touches, right? So it starts with this seduction. She thinks she's going to seduce the Bible salesman, and it's a meta joke for O'Connor because Holga had started thinking of it as a great joke, and then she'd begun to see profound implications in it. She'd lain in bed imagining dialogues for them that were insane on the surface, but that reached below the depths that no Bible salesman would be aware of. Their conversations yesterday had been of this kind. Things came to such a pass, and she's imagining what would happen, that she very easily seduced him, and that then, of course, she had to reckon with his remorse. True, genius can get an idea across even to an inferior mind. She imagined that she took his remorse in hand and changed it into a deeper understanding of life. She took all his shame away and turned it into something useful.
He steals her leg.
Yeah. And she's in this position of power, and then as it gets closer, we get these notes of the fact that she's actually innocent, right? She's really innocent, and she doesn't know much of the world, right? Which, and this again feels like O'Connor writing about herself. I may die too, she said suddenly, and looked up at him. Her eyes were very small and brown, glittering feverishly. She starts becoming more vulnerable and less monstrous, but she actually still needs to be both, right? For the joke to work at the end. And then there's that kiss. I love the kiss, which had more pressure than feeling behind it, produced that extra surge of adrenaline in the girl that enables one to carry a packed trunk out of a burning house, but in her, the power went at once to her brain, and she thinks like, oh, this is kissing, like it's something totally of the mind, which is comic and also kind of sweet. Like she really doesn't know. She's so out of her depth, right?
She's too smart for kissing in her
yeah,
which is its own funny thing. She kisses like a philosopher.
Yeah.
I've heard.
And then there's that kind of incredible exchange where they're talking about salvation and being damned. In a sense, she said, if you use the word loosely, you might say that, but it's not a word I'd use. I don't have illusions. I'm one of those people who see through to nothing. The boy was frowning. You got to say it. I said it and you got to say it. Right, talking about I love you. The girl looked at him almost tenderly. You poor baby, she murmured. It's just as well you don't understand. And she pulled him by the neck, face down against her. We are all damned, she said, but some of us have taken off our blindfolds and see that there's nothing to see. It's a kind of salvation. The boy's astonished eyes looked blankly through the ends of her hair. Okay, he almost whined. But do you love me or don't you? And especially given the fact that he's going to turn out to be basically the embodiment of evil, there's something incredible about it, right? And it's a sort of wise point, right? Like, okay, but do you love me? Is the real question. And it's sort of straightforwardly so. And then there's the leg. And all of a sudden we see where her depth is, right? She took care of it as somebody else would his soul, in private and almost with her own eyes turned away, which is both a hilarious description of the way that people take care of their souls. And she's drawing us into her really tightly. She's both mocking her and tender towards her at the same time because she's seeing her truly. And she felt as if her heart had stopped and left her mind to pump her blood. She decided that for the first time in her life, she was face to face with real innocence, which she is, but it's her own. This boy, with an instinct that came from beyond wisdom, had touched the truth about her. All right. It was like surrendering to him completely. It was like losing her own life and finding it again miraculously in his. And so now the language is straightforwardly religious, right? And it doesn't feel clunky at all. Like it's just utterly natural, and yet heavily religious language. And she's imagining a life with him where he takes her leg off and puts it back on every night. Because this is the most vulnerable she's ever been with somebody. And then there's the turn where he reveals, and she's like, "You're a Christian," she hissed. "You're a fine Christian." Well, they're both disappointed in each other. "You just a while ago said you didn't believe in nothing. I thought you was some girl," meaning I thought you were going to have sex with me, right? And she goes, "You're a fine Christian. You're just like them. I'll say one thing and do another. You're a perfect Christian. You're..." The boy's mouth was set angrily. "I hope you don't think," he said in a lofty, indignant tone, "that I believe in that crap." He's disappointed she's not a true nihilist. She's disappointed he's not a true Christian. It's beautiful, right? And then the line to me that is just, "Holga, I'll tell you another thing, Holga," he said, using the name as if he didn't think much of it. "You ain't so smart. I've been believing in nothing ever since I was born." And what is incredible to me, and then there's, he leaves, and then there's the very end where there's the Freeman and her boss talking. "He was so simple, but I guess the world would be better off if we were all that simple." Mrs. Freeman's gaze drove forward and just touched him before he disappeared under the hill. Then she returned her attention to the evil-smelling onion shoot she was lifting from the ground. "Some can't be that simple," she said. "I know I never could." What is interesting to me, even though he's a great character, he is actually kind of simple, right? The fact that he is evil means there's actually not that much to him, right? In terms of depth. He is simple. It's just not good to be simple. He's a trickster, he's amoral, and he's sort of fully revealed by the end, right? The person who gains depth and complexity by the end is Holga. And there's a letter, there's a, in Mystery Manners, a collection of her essays, there's a bit where O'Connor is talking about these nuns. There was a girl who died young, who had been cared for by a group of nuns. I'm gonna pull Mystery and Manners off of the shelf, which is right here. And she had like sort of horrible tumors on her face. And the nuns had come to O'Connor to write a, like, they wanted her to write a hagiography of this girl. And O'Connor was basically like, that's not really what I'm good at, you know? And also you knew her, so you should write the hagiography, right? You would be the ones who did, who, you know, who would be able to sort of do honor to her. But as she's thinking about writing about this girl and who this girl was, she says in her introduction, she wrote an introduction for the hagiography of a memoir of Marianne, who's the girl who's utterly disfigured. This opened up for me also a new perspective on the grotesque. Most of us have learned to be dispassionate about evil, to look it in the face and find as often as not our own grinning reflections with which we do not argue. But good is another matter. Few have stared at that long enough to accept the fact that its face too is grotesque, that in us the good is something under construction. The modes of evil usually receive worthy expression. The modes of good have to be satisfied with a cliche or a smoothing down that will soften their real look. When we look into the face of good, we are liable to see a face like Marianne's, full of promise. And so, to me, the kind of really sort of beautiful thing in the story is that, like, this horrible moment for Holga is actually the moment where she sort of comes alive to the things in her that actually matter. And because of who Holga is and the sort of bitterness of her life, she can only let those give expression through a distorted way. She can only allow herself to get into that situation when she tells herself that she's going to be corrupting and destroying a Bible salesman, right? And that narrative is the one that she has to give herself to allow her to do what she actually wants to do, or sort of needs to express about herself, or to find some sort of genuine connection and vulnerability. And it makes her both intensely sympathetic and also totally ridiculous at the same time. And O'Connor thinks that's all of us. Especially you, Sean.
Yeah, I feel like this is the music starts playing at the end of the Audible book, and this is Audible guy is about to come on. Like, you know, you always end on that high note, and then he scares the crap out of you at the end of it. Yeah, I had
my dad went to high school with that guy.
That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, he's from Lima, Ohio, and he's like, we just recorded this. We didn't know it was like the beginning of the thing, and then people kind of seemed to like it, so that we just kept it, you know.
That's what my texts sound like. That's the text sound that I get. This is Audible. Yeah. So I hadn't I was much more sympathetic to Helga, maybe focusing too much on her disability. It was interesting though, as you were kind of unpacking that, it's very clear she's almost predatory in her mind, which means
in her mind, but not in her reality. Yeah.
But intent matters, right? And so she gets a little bit what she has coming to her, and that gets to the point of what she's saying. But at the same time, like, you're right. The Bible salesman, I'm dropping his name. Like, he's a
Manly Pointer, which is not
a linear character. Name. Like, he doesn't wander too far off of the path. He's either pure, simple, and good, or pure, simple, and bad.
Yeah.
Which I think is great. But it is there's just something that you can't tell those stories without, like, there's just a simple, straightforward, matter of fact comedy in it.
Yeah.
It's hard, but we're at 6:55.
Any thoughts, folks? we've been going for, I think, about 85 minutes. So
I know I already spoke, so I will be very brief, but I keep thinking about how, of course, I completely get your point, Phil, that there are so many different types of humor, and we need to differentiate between like really aggressive, mockery, comic relief, you know, teasing, flirting. Like there are so many different ways to be funny. But it seems like there's something fundamental about humor that really only manifests when it's contrasted with darkness. And there seems to be a culturally universal kind of affinity toward dark humor. Yeah. And humor about pooping, fucking, dying, basically, right? Like that's it. That's what's funny. And people being dumb, and me being dumb, and you being dumb, that's even funnier. Yeah. And just fucking up, right? And we need to teach children how to laugh at themselves. It doesn't come naturally to people. It comes naturally to us to laugh at other people. And then you're supposed to kind of grow into a kind and generous person who can laugh at themselves. For many people, it doesn't, happen. And I keep thinking about how you need death in the shadow somehow for humor to come alive. And for it to really reach its own purpose.
These are the things that we're most ashamed of or afraid of, right? So the pooping and whatever. I mean, and also like there's the sort of things that, Bergson talks about, like our mechanical nature versus our sort of sense of ourselves. So there's the kind of absurdity, like the disjunction. And then there's things that we're afraid and ashamed of, right? That sort of come into the mix as well, and interact with that absurd. And there's also just like wordplay, as there's whole realms of humor that are just kind of like what am I going to think of as crass? Did you hear the one about the man with 5 dicks? His pants fit like a glove. Yeah, I don't know if there's like any depth to that, certain cleverness, but now I'm going to go from that to one of the Psalms. I think in relationship to, Psalm 139. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought from afar, for there is not a word in my tongue, but O Lord, thou knowest. So the beginning of the Psalm is like, hey, God, like, you know everything about me. And for like about 6 or 7 lines, it sounds really nice. It's like, I am truly known. And then at the 7th line of the Psalm, it goes, whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? And then it's all about like running away. And that to me is just the perfect, it's like to be known. And then you're like, everything? Like really nothing? Like,
but that's how the Talmud is. Like the Talmud is full of these asides, right? So you have, I don't know who's familiar with the text, but you have these like really like ideas with grandeur of like about honesty and faith and like, and then people are like, okay, but what if it's my wife? And the rabbi is like, well, if it's your wife, maybe don't be fully honest. Yeah. And you're reading and you're like, this is where stand-up comes from the yeshiva. Like, of course. Yeah, totally. The commentary, my ass. It was
one of my favorite
talking back.
Do you know the one where they're like arguing about the oven? And it's like some like obscure point of law, and there's like, there's like 5 rabbis against 1 rabbi who's like the greatest rabbi. It's like an ancient Talmudic story, and the one guy who's in the minority is like, if I am right, let the tree uproot itself, and the tree uproots itself. And then the other rabbis are like, no, like it says in the law that it's going to be decided by majority, and so the tree stops. And he's like, if I am right, let the wall, fall. And then they're like, it says in the law it's going to be decided by majority, and the wall stops. And then finally a voice booms from heaven, and God is like, why are you arguing? Don't you know that this rabbi is the best and he's always right? And then the rabbi goes, in the law, it says that it will not be decided by voices from heaven, but by the majority. And then it goes, later, Rabbi so-and-so met Elijah, and he said, what did the Lord do on that occasion? And Elijah says, he laughed and said, my creatures have defeated me. My creatures have defeated me. It's incredible.
The other version of that is the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, when he gives them a command and they say, "Good idea, my lord." Just, of course it's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'm God.
Right. And it's and so it's like that that struggling, like Jacob wrestling the angel, but also at the same time being like, what the fuck are you doing? And then you thread into that that like divine aspiration versus just the utter muck and mire and terror of human existence. And there's nothing funnier, right? And it's also, there's nothing more serious. And that's why I think, like, for me, the most serious writers have a sense of humor.
It's true, but I would argue against the kind of general thing that Anna was saying, that it's sort of a universal, because there are some really different I mean, I think about Romanian Black humor and sarcasm, and my fucking husband does not get it. And 26 years later, I just think I'm hysterical, and he I'm shaming, or, in these moments where I'm like, are you kidding me? I love you. Like, let's move on and just let's make fun of ourselves or whatever. And it's
same with Hungarians. Like, Americans are like,
and
you
Americans,
okay? And I'm like,
truly, Canadians also.
You don't get it.
I went
Canadians
from the Marine Corps
completely.
straight into an MFA program in New York City.
Yeah.
And there was a culture clash.
Exactly. And so I'm just actually fascinated by that, is that are these culture in Romania, it's definitely like the kind of Black humor is specifically about being taken over, being like very self, kind of effacing, but also like, fuck you to all of this. It's absolutely the kind of absurdist type of humor that's just like, seriously, again, we're like taken over. And so there's something about it that's actually really different from North American, consciousness and stuff like that. I find that fascinating.
I think it's really a very real thing, that some version of what's required for humor is identification with what I mean. You have your physical humor, but even there's some like self-identification with it. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is the commonality of experience yields the ability to expose the absurdities with something as simple as a chuckle or a shrug, where, like, if everybody's in the exact same spot mentally.
Exactly.
This is and this may be a great story to end on, as we're going to be respectful of folks' time, but this is one of the grimmest tales I can throw out there. Is we were someplace, somewhere, not important, in a spot where there were monkeys, who were very large monkeys, who were regularly attacking us, like human-size monkeys. And it came where once one of the monkeys ended up getting shot because it was about to murder one of the people there. And the guard had to actually shoot the monkey, and the monkey dies. And the monkey dies in some horribly, terribly contorted way, and bends over, falls down with the monkey ass right up in the air. And we're all kind of feeling this like sadness, because like we didn't want to do that. It was like the monkey was going to pull somebody's arm off, and we didn't know what to do. And it just kind of happened. And there was this like kind of hominid human form there, sitting there with his ass up in the air. And one of my guys just looks over me and goes, "Dibs." And we hadn't seen a woman in 180 days. And every single one of us
That's
knew
fucking
exactly
hysterical.
what he was talking about, and started laughing hysterically. And that's what I remember about that story. And that's how we got through it.
That's funny.
And now that's recorded. I didn't say it, nor did I shoot the monkey.
Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. This was a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, this was great. Phil, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for taking.
Thank you, Sean.
Put together the read list. It was awesome. That alone was worth my time. And Anna, thanks of course for setting up this community. And the original question of whether or not I knew Phil.
I think everybody here will go and read Flannery O'Connor until the morning lights. That's I can see. I know you guys. I've been looking at you for 3 years. I know what you have on your mind. I saw all the people ordering the books while Phil was talking. As you should be. Can't wait for part 2.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Good
Thanks,
night.
Phil.
Thank you so much, Phil. Sean, ciao.